From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It's barely 2 months since the inauguration, and yet it's already a presidency like no other. Every week brings a new spate of announcements from the White House, which unleash panic and alarm, and a near daily use of the word unprecedented.
President Trump is calling for the annexation of Greenland in a meeting in the Oval Office right now. If you have two NATO countries, one annexing the other, it sets up a very unclear situation, unprecedented in NATO history.
This is an unprecedented purge of military leadership. The president is firing the highest-ranking military officer in this country and other senior leaders. It is sending shockwaves through the Pentagon.
We are seeing an unprecedented attack, an economic war on Canada and Canadian workers by the U.S. Trump administration. The leveling of punitive tariffs on Canada and Mexico on the whim of a megalomaniac president.
President Trump is not only upending the world order. At times, he appears to be taking potshots at the American Constitution and undermining democratic norms.
The 22nd Amendment to the Constitution limits American presidents to 2 terms in office. That doesn't stop President Trump and those who support him, however, from suggesting a 3rd term.
Should I run again? You tell me. There's your controversy right there.
We want Trump in 28. That's what they can't stand. A man like Trump comes along only once or twice in a country's history. We want Trump.
To many, this is, well, as I might have mentioned before, unprecedented. But is it? Is this a dangerous transgression from the arc of American history, or a faithful return to it? How different is Donald Trump to his presidential predecessors?
Donald Trump is as much a product of American history as JFK or Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama or Joe Biden or FDR. It's just the history that we don't like to talk about, the history that we've misremembered, or at times the history that we've deliberately concealed.
The Story today, Donald Trump and a history of American authoritarianism.
I'm Nick Bryant. I'm the author of The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict with Itself. And for many years, I was a BBC Washington and New York correspondent. And for many years, I covered the presidency and the rise of Donald J. Trump.
You also wrote a book titled When America Stopped Being Great, which seemed to sit in the White House for an awful long time. Tell us about that.
Well, that's kind of you to mention it. If ever you were going to have an audience of one for a book that you wrote about America, you'd want it to be the President of the United States. It was a kind of weird story. I appeared on Morning Joe, that MSNBC show that I didn't realize at the time was actually Joe Biden's favorite political talk show. He used to watch it in the morning.
Nick, good morning. It's good to have you back with us. So tell us more about your thesis here and how far back you think this stretches for America.
My thesis, Willie, is that Donald Trump... And I was on one morning talking about my book about the rise of Donald Trump. And I think it just caught Joe Biden's ear because later on that morning, bizarrely, somebody texted me and said, I think Joe Biden's just mentioned your book. And I thought, wow, that's brilliant if he has, but that sounds pretty weird. Anyway, a few weeks later, somebody on Twitter just noticed that there was a stack of books behind Joe Biden's shoulder. There was a book about FDR. There was the memoir of Hunter Biden. And in between was my book, When America Stopped Being Great. And yeah, it sat there for 3 years, which would suggest that Joe Biden was a very slow reader, that he felt that he needed to consult it on a daily basis, or the other possibility, of course, he didn't even read it.
I'm going with the daily consultation.
Me too.
I feel it. Nick, you had a very long relationship with America. It predates the journalism. Tell us a bit about the first time you really arrived in America and fell in love with the place.
Well, I was 16 years old. It was the first time I'd ever boarded an aircraft. It was my first solo journey without my parents. And I arrived in Los Angeles on the eve of the LA Games. And it was an extraordinary summer, Manveen. It was the time, really, when America got its mojo back after the long national nightmare of Vietnam and Watergate and the Iranian hostage crisis, 1984 and the Olympic Games. And the chant USA, USA, which is fairly familiar now, was an invention of that summer, really. And you heard it from coast to coast because America was winning every single gold medal. And Ronald Reagan sort of perfectly encapsulated that newfound confidence in the slogan which became his election slogan in 1984. It's morning again in America.
Whatever else history may say about my candidacy, I hope it will be recorded that I appeal to our best hopes, not our worst fears, to our confidence rather than our doubts, to the facts, not to fantasies.
And he won 49 out of 50 states. He almost won the clean sweep. And one thing that fascinated me when I was in the States was how did we go from the self-confidence of it's morning again in America to the phrase I heard when Donald Trump delivered his first inaugural address, and I was stood 30, 40 yards away when he did it, American carnage.
And the crime, and the gangs, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
And a lot of my thinking over the last few years has been about, how did we end up at this point?
Nick, I know your books show how Donald Trump is sort of a historical inevitability in America's story. But watching him now, does it feel like he's changed America, changed the America that you know?
I think the thing about Donald Trump is he hasn't so much changed America as revealed America, or at least the America that a lot of people internationally are sort of surprised by, but has always been there in the history of the country. There's a long history in America, and a surprising history, of authoritarianism. There's a long history of demagoguery. There's a long history of presidents really trying to maximize their power and often exceeding the constitutional bounds that were supposedly imposed on the presidency. There's a long history of nativism. And so many of these things come together in the presidency of Donald Trump. And sure, he's unrecognizable from the presidents that we know, people like JFK, people like Ronald Reagan, people like George W. Bush. But if you go back into the 19th century, he's not unlike Andrew Jackson, who in his first administration was his kind of presidential soulmate. This was America's first populist president. He was a very uncouth president. He rode roughshod over Congress. He rode roughshod over the Supreme Court. Donald Trump really saw him as a kindred spirit. And I think if you sort of look at the 19th century and to a certain extent some of the presidents in the 20th century, Donald Trump isn't the historical outlier that is commonly supposed.
And just talk us through some of the things that have happened in the last 2 months, because I think there is such a barrage of headlines at the moment that sometimes they go unnoticed. But for you, as a close America watcher, what are the things that have even surprised you in terms of what Donald Trump has done, which slightly changed the democratic balance of the country?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm that surprised by a lot of what's happened. I thought he would try and dismantle government as we've known it since FDR and the New Deal, which is when the federal government in its present form really came into being. We knew that Donald Trump would try and dismantle that. I think we knew that he would kind of side with Putin in the war with Ukraine. I mean, seeing them beat up Zelensky in the Oval Office wasn't on my bingo card, to be honest. But that kind of shift, that changing of sides that we've seen, hasn't surprised me Shocking though it still is. Obviously, Trump isn't the leader of the free world anymore. He doesn't want to be. It's questionable now whether America is even part of the West. We're seeing the destruction of the transatlantic alliance.
There have been other surprising moments too. I mean, in terms of the checks and balances that you expect to contain the power of a president. I mean, watching him sack senior people at the Pentagon, including lawyers who would decide whether it was legal for him to go to war, it does feel like this is a very different world.
For sure, for sure. I'm not hugely surprised by that, Manveen, because I think we saw ample evidence in his first term of his authoritarian tendencies. And indeed, the people who work most closely alongside him have been the people who have been warning us about his fascistic tendencies. People like Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, describing him as fascist to the core. His former chief of staff at the White House, John Kelly, again, using the F word, the fascist word, to describe him.
Certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
So that dismantling of the Pentagon, that dismantling of the Justice Department, that dismantling of the federal government, and the replacement of all the people he's purged with Trump loyalists, I don't think that's come as a great surprise. I mean, sure, the speed at which it's happening is kind of dizzying.
I think what surprised me about your book was realizing how none of this is really new. You describe a scene, for example, when Trump was last in power, around the George Floyd summer, when there were protests across the country.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
And there are troops with guns lining the streets, in particular going up to the Lincoln Memorial. You describe them as looking like stormtroopers. And a lot of America was affronted by that, because obviously the Lincoln Memorial is seen as this great shrine to American democracy, and here was something that looked very much like an autocracy. And yet, as you say, it's because people conveniently forget the history. I mean, just tell us about that.
Yeah, that wasn't as historically anomalous as it seemed at the time. Lincoln rightly is seen as a great hero of the national story, not least because he fought a war which ended up with the freedom of the enslaved. But Lincoln was a trasher of the US Constitution. He rode roughshod over the First Amendment during the Civil War. He shut down a lot of papers that were critical of the Union. He suspended habeas corpus, this fundamental legal right. He imprisoned a lot of people that became political prisoners. And at the time, a lot of people regarded Lincoln as a dictator, somebody who had vastly exceeded the powers of the presidency. But a lot of people just did not mind that. And he has never been dislodged from his throne of historical grace.
And he wasn't the only one. I mean, I was quite surprised by the list of presidents. Many of the ones that we look back on as sort of great presidents of America who similarly weren't great with democracy.
Yeah, another classic example is FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who won the presidency in 1932 and was still president in 1945. FDR tried to pack the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court was against him. Many people regarded that as unconstitutional. Indeed, the great journalist of his day, H.L. Mencken, literally described FDR as an American dictator. FDR also violated this convention that you only serve 2 terms. FDR ended up winning 4 elections. He was re-elected 3 times. But you know what? The American people kept on re-electing him. The American people were quite happy for him to exercise this power. And his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, noticed in 1933 during his inaugural, the line that got the biggest applause was not the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which is the famous line from the inauguration. It was the line where he said, "You realize I'm going to have to adopt wartime powers during peacetime," which would have been a violation of the Constitution. But people were willing to accept that at a moment of economic and democratic crisis. And it makes the point that Americans have been willing to countenance a strongman president who sometimes exceeded the bounds of the Constitution.
That's fascinating. So you've got Lincoln around the Civil War, you've got Roosevelt, who's obviously a time when America is again in crisis after the Wall Street crash and the economy is failing. There's actually quite a long strain of authoritarian leaders. One of the historical precedents, though, I think most people won't have heard about is William McKinley. Tell us why he's suddenly relevant again.
Well, Trump has this man crush on William McKinley right now, which is really curious because in his first administration, he had this big man crush on Andrew Jackson. He even went down to his old slave plantation in Tennessee to pay homage to Andrew Jackson. He kind of came out saying, he's my kind of guy, you know, and now he's sort of rounded in on McKinley. Now, the most Americans know of William McKinley is he got shot and he got killed. He was the third president to get assassinated after Abraham Lincoln and Garfield. And he won election in 1896. And the reason why Trump loves him is because he was known as the Napoleon of protectionism. He was a big tariffs guy. And that's why Trump really likes him. And you remember in his inaugural address, he actually said,
President McKinley made our country very rich through tariffs and through talent.
And one of the things he promised to do was rename Mount McKinley Mount McKinley. It's the tallest mountain in America. It's in Alaska. Obama had actually renamed it to respect the indigenous name that it had originally had before it was called Mount McKinley.
We will restore the name of a great president, William McKinley, to Mount McKinley, where it should be and where it belongs.
And under his presidency, America really did expand its territory globally. They got Guam, they got the Philippines, they got Puerto Rico, they occupied Cuba for a while. And that became the first time they really had a kind of global mini empire. And Trump seems to like that bit as well.
Is this why we keep hearing about Greenland and Canada and everywhere else he seems to want to take over?
Yeah, but curiously, he's kind of got McKinley wrong. McKinley, at the end of his life, when he was assassinated, he'd become a big free trade guy. He'd seen the value in actually having mutually beneficial trade agreements. And he was a very accidental imperialist and not a warmonger by any means. In the Spanish-American War, he was kind of really press-ganding to going to war by a very belligerent Congress and a very belligerent tabloid press. And another thing about McKinley, I mean, he was a real war hero. In the Civil War, he was absolutely heroic. He'd go on suicide mission after suicide mission. They never thought he'd survive, but he did. And he was incredibly brave, which is obviously in contrast to the guy that got out of the Vietnam War because of his bone spurs in his feet. And the other thing was he was unfailingly polite. And that's not always a quality you associate with Donald Trump.
What does Trump sort of switching his hero worshipping from Andrew Jackson to McKinley in the first few months anyway of this presidency, does it tell us anything about how the second term might play out?
I think it's really interesting where he's got McKinley from. I don't think we've figured that out yet. I don't think anybody's asked him the question, when did you first develop this sort of man crush on McKinley? What does it tell us about the second term? I think it tells us that in the second term, this is more about Trump being Trump. This is about Trump being unleashed. I think in the first term, he came away thinking he'd been hemmed in by advisors, just not surrounded by the people that we called the grown-ups in the rooms. These moderating influences on Trump just aren't there. I mean, this is an administration packed with loyalists. They're getting rid of all the naysayers in the federal government. And I think that's the key difference that we see in the second term. This is Trump unleashed. This is peak Trump.
Thank you very much. Wow.
Nick, you were there in America covering the last Trump presidency and the way it ended with January the 6th. And it felt for a lot of Americans like that was the moment. There was no going back. They'd never known a president refuse to recognize that they'd lost an election.
Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Did you think he could possibly be re-elected again after that?
I thought it should have been a disqualifying moment. It should have been a moment of Republican repudiation of Donald Trump, but instead it became a moment of Republican radicalization. I remember being with Trump 6 weeks after January the 6th. He was making his first speech as a former president. It was a CPAC conference, it was this conservative conference in Orlando, Florida. He was appearing on a Sunday, which felt biblical. I mean, literally his supporters were gathered under palm trees outside.
Do you miss me yet? Do you miss me?
It literally felt like a second coming. I mean, there was a quasi-religious feel to the whole event.
I want you to know that I'm going to continue to fight right by your side. We will do what we've done right from the beginning, which is to win.
And in that moment, you just knew that he was still the spiritual leader of the American conservative movement and that Trumpism was very much alive. And rather than repudiating Trump, what we saw was a purge of the people who wanted to impeach Trump and prevent him from running again.
Nick, as you said, a number of the people around Donald Trump last time round have described him outright as a fascist. We all watched that moment of January the 6th. What does it tell us about America that none of that stopped the electorate wanting to vote him back?
There is a long history of political violence in America and a long history of a kind of legitimized political violence in America that goes back to the revolutionary ideology that the country was founded upon. Thomas Jefferson was one of the few founding fathers who wasn't freaked out by the French Revolution. He once said the tree of liberty has to be watered every now and then with the blood of patriots. And,
wow.
And that has become a slogan on the right. And one of the reasons, Manveen, why he managed to survive January the 6th was a lot of the people who were taking part in it really thought they were acting in the spirit of the original American Revolution. Some of them were literally chanting 1776 as they burst in through the doors of the US Capitol. A lot of people regarded that violence as legitimate and part of a revolutionary tradition.
And Nick, looking back at the founding fathers, the revolutionary leaders who created the American Constitution after the War of Independence with Great Britain, people like the first president, George Washington, how much are they to blame for where we are now? I mean, did the Constitution that they created, did it effectively allow for an imperial presidency?
Yeah. When the Founding Fathers came to write the Constitution at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, when they came to think about the presidency, they did so very much with George Washington in mind. And the Founding Fathers almost regarded him as a kind of one-man check and balance. And he really was George Washington. And he was very mindful of not abusing his presidential power. At a time when people like Alexander Hamilton, for instance, thought he should be a kind of elected monarch. And the thing is, the Founding Fathers didn't really spend a great deal of time, certainly not enough time, thinking about spelling out what the presidential powers were. They didn't give him a carte blanche. They did define what they thought his presidential powers should be, but the rule book was very incomplete, which is one of the reasons why the Supreme Court last year actually had to decide on presidential immunity.
The powerful Supreme Court has the final say on what presidents can and cannot do. Today's historic ruling means a president can never be prosecuted for anything that's part of their official duties, but they do not have immunity for non-official acts.
The Founding Fathers just had not addressed that question, and there are a lot of questions they didn't address when it came to presidential power. And I think we're going to be entering this period right now, I think, where we're going to be getting a civics lesson from hell. And we're going to be finding out where the gaps in the Constitution are. We're going to be finding out where the grey areas are when it comes to presidential power.
Donald Trump is a man who will definitely test the Constitution. We're already seeing it. He is a man who tears up the norms that you would expect from a president. And yet, given all the historical examples you've given us of presidents who have been quite authoritarian, who have often broken the rules, Should we be worried about him, or is he just part of the American story? Why is he so alarming to us?
The difference with Trump, I think, compared to previous presidents like Nixon, like FDR, like Lincoln, who really exceeded their powers, is he has a party right now, the Republican Party, who's willing to let him do it. During the Watergate crisis, it was actually Richard Nixon's own party that forced him to stand down. A bunch of Republican senators made the journey from Capitol Hill down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House and said, time's up. You've got to go. If you're not going to go, we're going to impeach you. We're going to have a Senate trial, and we've got the votes to convict you. That's never happened in American history, a conviction at the end of an impeachment trial. But the Republicans were telling Nixon, you've got to go. And he did. And he became the only president in history to resign. With FDR, when he tried to pack the Supreme Court, it was Democrats who said, you've gone too far. We can't back you on this one. Now, you've got a situation right now with the Republican Party. It's essentially the Trump party. There just aren't those people who are willing to go up against him and say no. For the most part right now, they're being pliant, they're being sycophantic, and they are going along with Trump, partly out of fear of being primaried if they don't, and partly because many of them are Trumpistas themselves and fully support this idea.
So that really is the difference here. You know, people like Richard Nixon were being held to account by their own party, and that doesn't seem to be happening now. What about the other checks and balances in the American system? I mean, do you think they'll hold together, or has he managed to maneuver this so that, you know, for example, with the Supreme Court, they kind of fall apart?
Well, this is the crunch point that I think we're approaching now. The problem with the Supreme Court is they haven't really got that many enforcement powers. So if they say stop doing that and he keeps doing it, then you're in this kind of constitutional crisis situation. Then you're in this kind of constitutional grey area. And in that situation, it's hard to know precisely what will happen because, you know, at the moment, the Republicans control the House of Representatives. They control the Senate. Donald Trump is really trying to control the top of the military and to purge the officers that he doesn't think are loyal. The Justice Department has been purged of people who will go up against him in the same way that the FBI, the CIA, all these sort of power centers in Washington are being made more Trump-friendly by the day. So for the next 2 years at least, you wonder where the resistance to Trump is going to come from.
And Nick, you've told us about some of the historical precedents, and particularly the ones that Trump talks about himself, Andrew Jackson, McKinley. What should we make of the fact that he also seems to really admire autocratic strongmen around the world, particularly Vladimir Putin? Is that something we should be worried about in terms of how he sees a presidency playing out?
I think that's a huge concern. I've never heard him express anywhere near the kind of admiration for people like Kim Jong-un, the North Korea dictator, who is homicidal. I mean, literally kills people with anti-aircraft guns. I mean, this guy is crazy. And yet I was on the Korean Peninsula where Trump embraced him like it was some sort of reality TV show where it was Married at First Sight or something. And Trump stepped over the DMZ and it was this kind of just this crazy moment. I mean, I'd also heard Trump and the UN threaten the evisceration of North Korea and wiping it off the map. That's how kind of unpredictable he can be. Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Trump expresses admiration for him. Then, of course, there's Putin. I mean, I've spoken to world leaders who've been in the room when Trump and Putin have been there, and they literally talk about Trump going weak at the knees.
Wow.
I don't understand that relationship. You know, he does seem to love these strongmen. He does seem to love these authoritarians. I think this deep admiration for Putin really defines his presidency, which is why it looks like America's literally changed sides.
How worried are you about the future of American democracy?
American democracy is fragile and sickly because it's never been that healthy. I think that's the crucial point to make about American democracy. The Founding Fathers didn't really want a mass democracy. They wanted it to be a closed shop. They left it to the states to decide who could vote, but basically it was white men of property. And it wasn't until 1965, remarkably, that we got what could truly be described as universal suffrage. You won't find the word democracy in the Declaration of Independence. You won't find the word democracy in the US Constitution. So American democracy has always been fragile and weak. But I do worry that under Trump, we could be moving towards something called an anocracy, which is somewhere between a dictatorship and a democracy. And I kind of worry that's our direction of travel at the moment.
Nick, you told us about the first time you arrived in America, this great moment of optimism. Tell us about leaving. What made you step away?
Well, a number of reasons. I now live in Australia. My wife is Australian. Our kids had reached the age while they knew why they were doing shooter drills at school. We had always said that would be the age that we'd leave America. You know, they crouch down in their classrooms, they pull down the blinds, they turn off the lights. They're told it's for a hurricane, but it's actually for a hail of bullets. And we'd seen the end of the Trump administration and the start of the Biden. I kind of made my decision to leave the BBC, frankly, the night that Biden was inaugurated. I remember making it on the train home that night from Washington. And that day had a really profound effect on me, Manveen. I mean, Washington that day felt like a garrison town. It felt like a city under occupation. Even the terminology that was used. They spoke of a green zone around Capitol Hill. That's terminology from Iraq. I mean, literally, Washington felt like Baghdad or the Potomac. There were 25,000 troops there. That was 10 times as many as in Afghanistan that day. And I remember getting to Capitol Hill that morning and they were testing out the order queue for Joe Biden. And bizarrely, the text that they decided to use to test the order queue was Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which ends with that question, can this nation long endure? And I left America not entirely sure that it could, frankly. And that was one of the reasons we left. And you know what? We left 3 years ago and we haven't been back.
Tell me about that. Well,
I kind of think I kind of worry that the America I fell in love with isn't there anymore, or even more deeply than that. I wonder whether the America I fell in love with was a kind of bit of a mythic America that maybe didn't truly exist.
That was Nick Bryant, close America watcher and the author of 2 brilliant books on the subject. One, a personal favourite of Joe Biden's apparently, When America Stopped Being Great, and The Forever War, America's unending conflict with itself. The producer today was Emily Webb, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.